Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me out. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think this is the first time I've actually spoken to the club, even though you've been meeting here a lot longer than I've been coming to RBG. It's also a real pleasure to be here during the centenary year of the club. Some of you will know that, of course, the Naturalist Club started off as the Hamilton Bird Protection Society. And that society was one of the factors that brought Royal Botanical Gardens into existence in the first place. So you are most definitely not just friends, but also in many ways senior partners to the whole RBG enterprise. So thank you for all of that. I started thinking about heritage trees a while ago and have had a chance to put some thoughts together. So I'm very grateful to be here and to share them with you tonight, acknowledging that there are an awful lot of people here who know more about trees and nature than I do. I'm not a horticulturist or an arborist, so that's a bit of an admission, I suppose. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging tonight the long history of First Nations and Métis people in the province of Ontario, and pay special respects tonight to the communities of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations. We're meeting on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat nations. And again, RBG is very proud to be partnering with some of our First Nations friends on some exciting new projects. I also have to do a couple of very quick acknowledgements tonight. I like getting them out of the way at the beginning. First, a lot of my work right now is being supported by the Ontario Trillium Foundation. And this foundation is supporting a program that we call informally Heritage and Heroes. And what we're trying to do is to take a fresh look at the landscape of Royal Botanical Gardens from a historical and cultural perspective. What's on the landscape? How did it get there? How do we use it? How do cultural groups use it? And some of what I'll be talking about tonight reflects some of the research we've been doing into this. So again, thanks Trillium for that. I also have to acknowledge a lot of people that have been helping me in the last couple of years get my head around some of the things I'll be talking about tonight, including folks in the province of Ontario at the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport, people like Paul O'Hara, who is a local naturalist and runs a magnificent business, Blue Oak Native Landscapes. I'll be mentioning some of his observations later. City of Hamilton has got some wonderful cultural heritage planning people. So again, thanks to everyone for your help and bringing me along. I am by no means an expert. I am just an enthusiast. And what I've realized in thinking more and more about the landscape here and about trees as individual organisms is that we have some interesting challenges, but also opportunities. The first important challenge is the widespread situation that's called plant blindness. Plant blindness is the concept that an awful lot of people do not see plants as individual organisms. They're just the green leafy backdrop to the things with the blinky dewy eyes. I actually was at a club meeting that I go to in Toronto every month and had a friend who's a quite senior person in one of the naturalist organizations at the national level in Canada. I won't say what it was. But he actually tried to argue that it's no use talking about things like plants and conservation efforts to the public because all they care about are the animals, because the animals move and can look back at you and you have an emotional resonance with animals. I think that's a really unfortunate perspective. Plants are the living fabric of the landscape. You cannot have habitat without plants. And for the most part, they're not generic plants. They have to be the right species if you want ecological partnerships with the animals, if that's what you're interested in. So how do you relate to trees? Well, trees have all sorts of ways of being important to people. Those are called instrumental values. And again, if you've ever had a grade 9 philosophy course years ago, you probably heard of some of those kinds of things. They're pretty obvious. We value trees for what they give us, for their shade, for their timber, for their non-timber values, for what they do in the habitat, even carbon dioxide capture. I hope anyway, that most of the people in this room will also believe that trees have some intrinsic value. We don't necessarily have to relate to another organism just because it can do something for us. I think we have to be thinking about what we can do for them and what they have going on without humans necessarily in the equation. But for thinking about this concept of heritage trees, humans are right in the middle of it because humans are creatures of landscapes. We live on landscapes and we change landscapes. And a couple of concepts to introduce at the beginning might be helpful. One is this thing called the cultural landscape, and this is a concept that's nearly a century old. It was created by an American landscape geographer named Carl Sauer. And he said that the cultural landscape is fashioned from a natural landscape by a cultural group. Culture is the agent, the natural area is the medium, the cultural landscape is the result. The influence of a given culture, itself changing through time, the landscape undergoes development, passing through phases, and probably reaching ultimately the end of its cycle of development. With the introduction of a different, that is an alien culture, a rejuvenation of the landscape can take place, or a new landscape is superimposed on the remnants of the old one. Now that's again an early 20th century view of things, but it helps us understand that landscape is not a static thing. When we look out at landscape, whether it's a natural area or a built environment, or a landscape that's dominated by human beings, it's never static. It's always changing. And we can understand and seek to understand the factors that brought about the current situation. What that does for us when we take time and look at where we are and connect to it deeply is develop something called a sense of place. And I really think that trees are central in our understanding of a sense of place, whether you're in an urban area or a natural area. Kent Ryden is an American geographer, and he wrote, "The place has become a shaping partner in our lives. We partly define ourselves in its terms, and it carries the emotional charge of a family member or any other influential human agent." Think about how much you might love your favorite place to go. You go there and you feel rejuvenated, you feel energized. Your feet are roots in the ground and your hands reach up towards the sky because you know that place. And think about how much that hurts, what an arrow in the heart that is if that place is disturbed or damaged or destroyed, accidentally or even on purpose by other people. We change places all the time. It's something that humans have done for millennia, but we attach ourselves to place. And if we want to understand and I think enrich our lives, we recognize that and we work with the idea. How can we actually communicate a sense of place with other people if you know something so well? I've developed an enormous sense of this for the landscape at Royal Botanical Gardens over the past 2 decades. I didn't think I would. It was a turtle bite. So the question then is, what is heritage? What does it mean to be talking about heritage? This is actually a photograph I took a few years back in Tombstone, Arizona, where kind of the quintessential distillation of the American view of the Old West is the battle at the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona in the 1880s, where one group of idiots with another group of idiots had guns and they shot at each other. Nobody remembers why anymore. All that matters is that they had guns. And it was arid, and they had horses, and they were sweaty, and they were manly because they were wearing chaps. Or in this case, blue jeans. But heritage in this case is completely contrived. You're looking at a recreation of a stagecoach, a couple of nice heavy draft horses that would never have been used to pull a stagecoach, in the middle of a shopping mall. But what heritage is all about, and as far as I've come to understand it, is the stories we tell. So I can ridicule this, and I think it's funny. It's part of American tourism, and we have our versions in Canada too. But it's about the storytelling more than anything else. What kind of story can you tell? Well, this was a story about winning the Old West and people battling it out in a time when law wasn't perhaps as capable as it is today, or was anyway. But Tombstone is also a really interesting location. It's just north of the Mexican border in Arizona, and it has to have this. Has anybody been to Tombstone, Arizona? You know what this is? This is the world's biggest rose plant. This is a rose tree in Tombstone, Arizona. It covers 8,000 square feet. Imagine, it's bigger than this room by a long shot. It's a Ladybanks rose that was planted in 1885. It came from Scotland. And consider what someone has had to do for the past 135 years to keep a rose tree alive in Tombstone, Arizona. I wouldn't want to think about the water footprint of this tree. There's even a museum in the town of Tombstone dedicated to their rose bush. They tell stories about this tree, about the people that planted it, that it's another side of Tombstone. And I think it's actually a fascinating one, because if all you see in Tombstone are the guys with the chaps on the horses doing their manly things with guns, you miss the fact that this was a frontier town where people were trying to bring along civilization with them. And again, we can judge that in retrospect, but they were trying to make habitable this part of the Arizona desert. And one of the ways they did that was with plants. They brought in plants and made plants that were familiar to them part of the landscape. And so here is a tree where it shouldn't exist, but exists there because of people. And it exists there today because of the stories that people can tell about it. It's a fascinating, fascinating little place. This gentleman, of course, Isaac Newton, is very well known as an alchemist and the master of the British Mint. He's the guy who invented the knurling around the outsides of coins. If you've ever wondered why coins have those little ridges around the outsides, it's because of Isaac Newton. Because before that, people would make coins that weren't quite so regular, and they would chip pieces off of the coins and sell little pieces of silver, and coins would be valued. Newton put a stop to that, among other things. Now, Newton has got all kinds of stories told about him. One of the most famous ones has to do with his vision, a visionary inspiration that brought about his description of how gravity works. So the Newtonian theory of gravity is that tiny little equation up there. It's actually very simple. The force acting between two objects is simply the product of the mass of the two objects multiplied by a gravitational constant and divided by the square of the distance between them, the radius. So it's a remarkably simple little equation if you take your time to go through it, not the way I presented it. But it explains something that people have been trying to figure out forever. What was gravity? Now, does anybody remember the story about what inspired him? What was it? Apple tree. The apple tree still lives. This is Isaac Newton's family apple tree in Lincolnshire. There's also a cutting of it growing in Cambridge. It sits outside the manor where Newton was born, and it's probably, it wasn't tagged, it's probably the tree that Newton was near if he did in fact see an apple fall. And it said, oh wait a minute, this is just what the moon does. That was the real leap of inspiration, wasn't it? Seeing a falling apple and saying, that's exactly what the moon's doing. And he brought it together and said, wait, this makes sense. Now, there is part of the story which is completely apocryphal. It didn't hit him in the head. That was Walt Disney. But this is the idea that these trees, these individual organisms, can be linked to human stories. The fact that it's an old apple tree is only marginally interesting. There are other orchards in the UK with apples going back to the time of Shakespeare and earlier. But this particular tree is linked to that story. And that story gives us modern physics and does things like little landers on Mars. So trees, I think, have some interesting connections to landscape and to stories at the human level. And a lot of these stories I'm going to bring up tonight are not trees way off in nature someplace doing their own thing. They tend to be trees where people are because we're talking about human stories. They have deep capacity to resonate with us. If you don't know the writings of Oliver Rackham, who died in 2015, I commend him to you. He was a prof at Cambridge, probably the absolute dean of writing about forests in England. And if anybody can write about forests in a lyrical way, it's people in England. He wrote, ancient trees are not only objects of beauty, wonder, and delight, They are historical monuments and witnesses to past activities of people, animals, and other plants, of course. Great little example. It's not a terrifically easy photograph to see there, but this is for Jim Mack, who's here tonight, our head of horticulture. That photograph is a Japanese cedar, Cryptomeria japonica, and that grows at RBG's rock garden, that little plant. It was planted in 1930. That's the first plant planted on purpose at Royal Botanical Gardens. It still exists. It's been a witness to the development of that garden, the rock garden on the Burlington Heights, since it was planted in 1930. It saw all of those weddings, all those special events through the decades at the rock garden, and sailed right through the rejuvenation of the rock garden a few years ago, and is still there. And we're doing things now like looking at old postcards from the 1930s and spotting all the old trees that still live on the rock garden, and a whole lot of them are still there. They were planted in the 30s. So one of the things we're trying to do with this project to reconnect people and landscape is not just looking at landscape as a surface, but the other living things that are there. What stories can we recreate? What stories can we pull together? Now, a challenging thing in talking about heritage trees is that there are several interacting terms people use, and they're all used really, really loosely, which drives me crackers, because I'm a biologist. I like understanding my terms and being consistent with them. So a heritage tree is a tree that has heritage value. It has something identifiable with it that connects it to human heritage, a story, a place, a person, a designer. All kinds of things could qualify a tree as a heritage tree, and I'll talk about some of them. Another term you often run into is champion tree. And like the name sounds, champion tree is often the biggest or the oldest of a particular species. There are lists of champion trees in the province of Ontario, individuals of specific species that are the biggest or the oldest. Even if nobody's ever looked at them for 100 years, they can still be a champion tree if they are demonstratively the biggest. And some organizations put together things called honor rolls of trees. They're somewhere in the middle. Some honor rolls list trees that are very, very large or very, very old. Some of them have heritage value. It can be a mixed bag. So my first take-home message from this talk tonight is there's no single thing called a heritage tree. There are a couple of different organizations that give the designation out formally, and I'll touch on those. But you do have to make inquiries if someone's talking about a heritage tree as to what they're actually talking about. I also think that those kinds of descriptions miss a couple of things. Again, I am a biologist. I would love to see there be more recognition of the ecological and even the genetic importance of some of these trees. Individual trees can be ecosystems in their own right. A big oak is a fantastic ecosystem if it's a native oak that's buzzing with insect life and bird life. So thinking about trees only in the context of the human stories is not the end of my story. I absolutely to recognize their biological importance as well. And some of these old trees are centuries old. They are individual time capsules carrying their genes forward in time. And that's extremely valuable today when we're seeing ecosystems collapsing, genetic diversity being eroded. To have those samples of trees that may be several hundred years old is a gift to us for the future if we can preserve them. So who decides? Well, the one big active group right now in Ontario is Forests Ontario. This is kind of a general group of forestry companies and interested individuals and agencies. And they do actively designate heritage trees. You can easily find their website, Forests Ontario, and online you can nominate heritage trees. They have an active process even today. There is a heritage designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. And there's a few trees that we'll touch on which actually have formal heritage designations, equivalent to the heritage designation of a building. They're relatively rare though. Some things are National Historic Sites of Canada. You're actually at one of them. Royal Botanical Gardens is a National Historic Site of Canada. And so those trees that are on those sites could consider to have some sort of designation. And as I mentioned, there was this honor roll. Now, some years ago, 30 years ago, Burlington had an honor roll of trees. And I was really fascinated to find out about this, and even more fascinated to find out that RBG used to run it. But for many, many years now, the program's been in abeyance. I have quietly mentioned to people that maybe this is something that could be done again. But these lists do exist in terms of trees. Now, Forest Ontario has a very overarching definition of heritage tree. It can be a tree that's of particularly important or impressive size or form or shape or rarity or beauty, or if it's culturally interesting, or if it's cherished and recognized as a landmark. All of those things can go into the argument that a particular tree should be recognized as a heritage tree. So it's not a single bin, it's not a simplistic thing to do. There's lots of good reasons to argue an individual tree might be designated as a heritage tree. And online you can find a map that shows all the trees that are designated so far as heritage trees in the province. Given how many trees there are in the province, that isn't too many. That's actually only a few tens. Let's take a look at a couple of them, just for fun in our area. There's one up in Burlington, right close to the northern end of the beach strip here in Burlington. And this is called the Allview Oak. It's a white oak, and this is perhaps one of the best examples of a heritage tree in our immediate area. It's a stunningly big tree. I mean, I love any tree I can't get my arms around. I figure this is just such a cool thing to try to hug. This tree was notable because it was used as a land marker in treaties that were being written in the 18th century. It was that big then. In fact, it was associated with the first settler in the Burlington area, Joseph Brant. Brant was a Mohawk, but he was from Ohio, and he settled in Burlington as part of the settling of the area. And this tree was used as a marker that was used in laying out not only his property in Burlington, but also one of the treaties with the Mississauga Nation for where the lands were to be covered by various treaties. So this is an ancient and venerable and beautiful tree. It's got a really strange setting. If you would imagine a tree that's 400 years old and venerable, you'd expect it would have a really great thing. It's in fact on the road. It's in the road. This is Allview Avenue in Burlington. There's the harbor, and the tree has the road built right around it. I hope it's doing okay. It looks like a stressful situation to me. It was designated as a heritage tree by Forests Ontario in 2011. So it's recognized as a heritage tree, but this designation has no importance. It does not give any protection to the tree whatsoever. And the tree sits actually in somebody's driveway as well. So some lovely house here on Allview Avenue, and these folks have to be very careful as they leave their driveway. There is a little sign on the tree that marks it as the survey benchmark for the boundary of the Mississauga Nation Purchase of 1792 and Brant's Block Purchase of 1797, recognized as an Ontario heritage tree. But even that little sign doesn't tell you who recognized it, unfortunately. Still, it's a wonderful tree to go and visit. It really is stunning to stand under a tree and realize that the branches of the tree you're under dip out into the backyards of the houses on either side of the road. That's how big this tree is. Another one that's in our immediate area is in the town of Dundas, right along Cross Street, which is the road that runs from the main street up toward the Dundas Driving Park. There is a gigantic tulip tree. This is a native species. It's probably hundreds of years old. And it was designated in 2010 by the same agency as an Ontario heritage tree. You cannot put your arm around it. It's on private property, so you can't just walk up to it without permission. But this is also such an amazing tree. If you walk up Cross Street, it's so big you can't see it because it's behind all the other trees. You can see it, but you don't take in the scope of this tree, even as you're walking up on the side, along it on the side. My favorite place to look for it is at the Sydenham Cut. As you're driving up from Dundas, you can park there and you can look down over the town of Dundas, that magnificent view. And once you know what to look for, boy, it's obvious. This tree sticks up above the canopy by probably a good 50 feet. This is a big tree. These kinds of trees are in our landscape today, and the only reason that this has been designated by Forests Ontario as a heritage tree is that someone went to the problem of doing it, of looking it up, of documenting it, and making a submission that it should be recognized as a heritage tree. But like the Allview oak, it's publicized, there's no signage there, there's no label there, but it is recognized as a heritage tree. Another one that's much easier to see, and I think fantastic, beautiful, is a chinkapin oak in Dundas. And again, if you know Dundas, there's a little park across the street from the Dundas Lofts, the old primary school, right on Highway 8, just before you go up the hill. There's a gigantic oak tree there. It's part of a small park, Fisher's Mill Park, that was donated to the city by the Fisher family. And it was designated as a heritage tree by Forests Ontario in 2012. And this is, again, unless you actually stop and look at it and let it sink in for a minute, you don't see the size of this tree. But if you walk up under it, and again, I'm not small, I stand about 6 feet, and my arms go about a quarter of the way around the trunk. It's impressive indeed. I don't have a good picture of it here, but it's even a beautiful trunk just to get close to and look at and see the shells from the cicadas and the mosses and the lichens and things on the trunk of this enormous oak tree. Now, another way that a tree can be designated as a heritage tree is under the Ontario Heritage Act. The Ontario Heritage Act gives municipalities and the province the opportunity to recognize something that is telling us a really interesting story about our history. And the criteria that can be used for a heritage tree are the same criteria that can be used for a heritage building or a heritage site, like a battlefield or something like that. It has to have direct association with a theme, event, belief, person, activity, organization, or institution that is significant to the community. It can yield or has yielded information that contributes to understanding that community. So it's not just about its size. It's really about the story it tells us about that community. And there's a strong message through all of these criteria about defining communities. It demonstrates or reflects the work of an artist, an architect, a builder, a designer, or a theorist. So if someone created a magnificent design for a park, and there was a tree that was integral to that park, that can be heritage. And all these other things as well. It can be a landmark, something that's a substantial landmark because people have used it as a wayfinding aid or just because it's so beloved as part of the landmark. All these things can be used as part of the argument that a tree should be considered a heritage. It's a wonderful example out in Niagara called the Comfort Maple. This is possibly the oldest sugar maple in the province of Ontario. It's not far from East Pelham, and it is its own conservation area. It actually is within the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, and it has I think it's about a quarter of an acre of land, which is designated as the Comfort Maple Conservation Area. Those fences outline the entire conservation area. It's got a lovely dedication here explaining the story. It's called the Comfort Maple because of the Comfort family that owned the farm in the 19th century. And it was, as the sign says, accepted for preservation in the 1960s by the Conservation Authority from Miss Edna Eleanor Comfort, whose family had owned the land since 1816. And of course, in this case has a religious epithet, which is fine if you like that sort of thing, noting that it is in fact a glorious tree. There's some very charming interpretation around it that's intended to keep it from being abused. This is a sign that says, "I am the Comfort Maple. I am the very model. I am the Comfort Maple. I am fragile and very old. Please do not climb or hang on my branches. I want to be here for future generations to enjoy." At least this one's got some signs. we can understand why it's designated as a special tree. The back of it looks a little different. The front of the tree is what you saw before from a little parking area. If you walk around to the back, you can see that it has had some life experiences. In fact, it's been hit by lightning several times. And if you get up close to the trunk, you can see that it looks a little bit like the bottom of the space shuttle. It's not the recommended way of dealing with damage to trees necessarily, but it's been bricked up so that that big opening, that big hole, is no longer accessible. Now, if you go, again, even closer and look at some of those space shuttle tiles, of course they're covered with graffiti. So even though they're signed, people certainly climb on this beautiful tree. There's also something else there. I don't know if you can quite spot it. Does anybody see this line coming up and down here? Does anybody want to guess what that is? It's a metal cable. It's part of a lightning rod. The tree has its own lightning rod. So it's a wonderful tree. It's got so much. Another one that's got official designation is Oakville's Great Oak. The town of Oakville apparently only has 5 oak left in it that predate colonization by Europeans. This is one of them. And this is right in the middle of a road. I think, is this Bronte Road? Is this Bronte Road? It was straightened a few years ago, and there was a big fundraising campaign to make sure that the road actually left the tree alone. It does have its own traffic island, so the road goes either side of the tree. But it's a lovely tree as well, and fantastic thing to see as you drive past on the road. One of the newest heritage trees in our area, of course, deserves special recognition given that we've just passed the centenary of the end of the First World War, and that's a Vimy oak that's been planted recently in Waterdown. Vimy oaks, has anybody heard of the Vimy oaks? Some have? Okay, it's really an interesting thing. These are actually English oak. They're not French. So go away, you silly English Canadians. No. On Vimy Ridge during the First World War, the landscape, of course, was blown to smithereens by shells in that horrifying warfare. There had been stands of English oak on the Vimy Ridge, and some Canadian soldiers that were on the site found acorns on the site and brought them home and started growing them. And there's I've got some of you folks I'm sure know it even better than I. There is a stand of these Vimy oak in Ontario, from which there is now an effort to repropagate from those oak. You can buy them. You can buy a Vimy oak and help to support this plantation of these historical oak. Just this past year, the Prime Minister of Canada took these plants back to Vimy, and there are now these Canadian explant Vimy oak growing at Vimy again. Again, an amazing story, not because it's a fantastically special oak tree. There are oak trees in England that are the same species, but because of that story we can tell about this being part of that landscape that was obliterated during that horrifying war, and that some of the people who survived that battle had the foresight and the connection to the land to pick up some acorns. What a simple thing to do, and yet moving. Now, I don't know if you've seen this oak. I don't mean to generate humor at its expense, but it's got its own lovely plaque. It's been formally designated by a bylaw of the city of Hamilton as a heritage tree, and that's it. It sits in its own protective little cage in front of the Legion in Waterdown, and it's about 4 feet high right now. Now, hopefully, this militaristic armor that it's wearing will mean it will have a chance at a long life. An oak tree certainly should have one. But there's a point to this, apart from trying to tell that story for you, which is that a heritage tree doesn't have to be 200 years old or 300 years old. This is a 3-year-old tree. But it can be used to tell the story. And the people who planted it in front of the Legion worked with the city of Hamilton to pass the bylaw. And it's that bylaw that has to be passed by a municipality that engages and turns on heritage designation. So celebrate that little tree. It's really quite amazing. People are driving by, they have no idea what it is. It looks like a garbage can as you're driving by it quickly, but it has such a moving story. Yes, sir.
There's actually a sign out with a whole story on the Daily Ridge.
Excellent.
I was part of that group.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you for that. So yes, I was there before the sign went up, I guess. But it is, again, my invocation of a bit of humor is only because this does look a little funny, but to bring home the point that a heritage tree does not have to be the comfort maple to tell a moving story. And that's what this is about. It's also interesting to take a look at the trees that are listed in Ontario as heritage trees under the Heritage Act. Another important realization is they're not all native species. This is not about their biological value, but the stories they tell. So take a look at that list, guys. There's other Japanese cedars on here. There's a honeysuckle. Oh, good, honeysuckle. There are two ginkgo biloba, now the world's most common street tree globally, that are listed as heritage trees in the province of Ontario because of their context, because of how they are situated in the landscape and who they're associated with. I hate to see it. There's a couple of Norway maple. But again, it's the stories they tell. So the majority of trees in the province that have heritage designation are native taxon. But the stories they are telling are about the landscape that people have been interacting with for the most part over the past 2 centuries. And so there are European, outside of Ontario, and Asian species on the list. So, as I mentioned, designation does not imply protection. Heritage bylaws have to be enacted by a municipality to really bring a heritage tree up to some level of having specified protection around it. And that requires action and energy and time, and perhaps even a bit of money to get the lawyers to write the darn things. But it does give the capacity for municipalities to to prohibit the destruction or the injury of a specific tree if it has that designation. There are also other mechanisms. There are heritage and conservation easements. If a tree or a woodlot or some other assortment of trees have a strong heritage value, it's possible, just like a conservation easement, to work with the government to protect that landscape and get a tax benefit for doing so. What's really important also for protection is a body that owns the landscape that's committed to its protection. That's also key, and again, not necessarily the case everywhere. Now, I don't ever mean to speak for Indigenous people. One of the most important things we're learning, I think, in having a great dialogue with some of our Indigenous friends is the role of a white guy like me should be to help step aside and give space, but I want to draw to your attention something that Paul O'Hara in our area has been doing some really interesting work on in the past few years, which you may come across on trails. And these are Indigenous trail marker trees. Trees that have been shaped probably centuries ago as part of trail markers used by First Nations. Paul, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, operates a nursery in the area dealing with native trees. And he's done a lot of research documenting these very strange looking trees. If you look at a tree and it looks very tortured, often it, in fact, is a This is a generalized sketch I've taken from the literature as to how these trees were created as a marker tree. Again, I'm sure I would be corrected if I had a knowledge keeper with me, and I would welcome that if it came up. The idea would be to take a young sapling, bend it over and stake it in the direction you wanted to indicate. And then take off the crown and the branches you didn't want, and let the tree grow up from the remaining branch. And you end up with a tree with a very specific and rather peculiar looking appearance. Often a very strongly bent trunk, and then vegetation branches coming straight up off of that trunk in one direction. So I simply wanted to bring that to your attention, that these trees are out there in the landscape still in some cases. I haven't yet found examples in Ontario, but in the States there are examples of trees that were used as trail markers in the Underground Railroad. And some of them have survived and are increasingly being honored as landmarks in the US. The photograph there, for example, is in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's a 300-year-old poplar tree that's managed by the National Park Service Network, telling the story about the Underground Railroad. And there are folks who are increasingly coming to interpret the role of vegetation and nature in the operation of the Underground Railroad. I don't know nearly enough about this. I would love to find out more. I wanted to mention a few examples, even much closer to home than some of the ones that I have. And this is one for my colleagues here at RBG. We have some spectacular trees at RBG. Some of them are planted. Some of them have been growing here for centuries naturally. One of the ones that we're looking at right now is across the street from RBG Center in Henry Park. It's a red oak that we imaginatively call the Henry Park Red Oak. We've been actually trying to find another name for it, if we can work out some context for it. For example, we know in the 1870s that this land was owned by two farmers side by side. One was named Alex Henderson, and one was named Sam Smoke. So maybe it was the Smoky Henderson tree, or something like that. It's a beautiful big red oak. It sits out in the middle of the park, and our horticulture department is working on ways of protecting it from damage and also interpret it a bit further. And we've been going back into the archival records, and photographs are fantastic for doing this. Here's the oak, pre-1963. There's actually two trees there, though. We don't see the second one today. So at one point in time, there were two trees there side by side. Here's an aerial view about 1963 of the area where we are. We're, in fact, right here. The building that we're in, this part of the building was built in 1979. Here's the original RBG Center. Across Plains Road, here's the Oak Alley, without any oaks yet. The Rose Garden's up here, and here are two oaks. A black oak on this side, and the Henry Gates, and here's the red oak. Another aerial view, probably from the same flight, again shows the red oak, the black oak, and the Henry Gates. I'm glad that this shows the Henry Gates because it's also an interesting feature. This is the only thing at RBG that has a heritage bylaw designation. We are a National Historic Site of Canada. We're a prescribed public body under the Ontario Heritage Act, but the only thing that technically has legal protection are the gates. This is because the City of Burlington brought a report and a bylaw through council that defines a 1 meter by 1 meter area all the way around the gates and says this is a heritage site. That's what we have so far here. So we're looking at how we can celebrate this tree, draw attention to it, and make sure it's part of the landscape. I was warned not to do that. So it was unfortunately the big limb fell off it. The decision was made once we could see the condition of the tree that it had to come down. It was also right beside our big wedding tent out there, and we did not want to pose any hazards to anyone. This is an important part of RBG's history. Some of you may remember that in 2004 we had a child die in the Arboretum because of an oak. So we keep a very careful eye on the condition of these trees, whether they're along trails or in our cultivated garden areas. But I love this quote from Penelope Lively, who's a British writer. She wrote, "We should do everything I should do that in a British accent. We should do everything we can to prolong the lives of ancient trees. They are witnesses to the past, survivors in historic landscape. Each has its own significant story." Another one that has a great story to tell about the early days at Royal Botanical Gardens and the development of botanical gardens in North America is the Dawn Redwood across the street. This is I'm blanking. Jim, what's the scientific name of Dawn Redwood? I shouldn't ask you. Yeah, blastoides, Gymnocladus blastoides. This is a beautiful big tree. We have photographs of it being planted as a sapling. That's it. In 1952, surrounded by Norman Radforth, our first director, and some of our board members. That's Judge Schwinger, for those of you might know the names. And this is a plant that tells a story about the exploration of plants around the world. The Dawn redwood was a fossil. It had been, something like it had been known from the fossil record for a very long time. But about 1947, it was discovered in China, growing. And people brought cuttings out and propagated it. And by the early 1950s, a few of them were going out to major botanical gardens around North America. And you can find some of these Dawn redwoods in places like Missouri Botanical Garden and the Arboretum. And they're the sisters to this beautiful big tree that we have across the street in Henry Park. I've been watching for these trees as I've been doing some travels, and ours is smaller than the others. The ones, there's a pair of them at Missouri Botanical Garden, which has, of course, a much longer growing season. They're big trees. This is a mighty tree in Hamilton. This one right here, sorry, in Walworth, across the street, the Dawn redwood, Metasequoia, I'm sorry, Glyptobastoides. I still can't say that properly. It's a wonderful tree. It's a deciduous conifer. So like the larch, it drops its leaves in the wintertime. But it has that story to tell about plants coming out, plants being explored and brought into landscapes and being brought all over the world as part of the work of botanical gardens. Some of these trees no longer exist, and they tell some interesting stories too. You might know the song, The Maple Leaf Forever. My grandmother could play it on the piano. That song was originally a poem written by Alexander Muir in Toronto in the Leslieville neighborhood, inspired by a giant old silver maple. And the maple fell 5 years ago, unfortunately, in a storm. It came down. Saplings have been propagated from seeds from that plant. And there is a Maple Leaf Forever Park in Leslieville, not far from this site. But one thing that was really interesting that happened was that the city saved the wood. Trees are made of wood. And they dried it and cured it. And a whole series of interesting artifacts have been crafted from the wood from this historical heritage tree. Some artistic bowls. This is the base of a flag standard that's used at Queen's Park, carved with maple insignia. Even guitars being played by Tragically Hip and Blue Rodeo have been fashioned from the wood from that silver maple. Another one that's famous in our area and was mentioned at the beginning of the talk is an elm, a white elm or American elm that used to live along Main Street in Westdale. And this tree germinated sometime around 1650. That's before LaSalle landed out here at LaSalle Park in 1669. It was a good-sized sapling before LaSalle arrived. And unfortunately, like so many of the elms, but not all of them in Ontario, it succumbed to Dutch elm disease in the 1970s. That photograph does show a fully grown man beside the tree there. So that's an idea of how magnificent this tree was. We have a cookie of it here. We have a slice through the trunk. And it's actually now in what's called the Wentworth Elm Room next door in the lunchroom, in the RBG Cafe. If you're having lunch, drop in and see it. Our education department years ago worked on this specimen, counted the rings, and set up interpretation on it with a bit of an explanation and the timeline running from 1665, about the time it was growing early on. So here's LaSalle coming here, the 1700s, the first settler in our area. There were a couple of people in Dundas. Richard Beasley settled on the Burlington Heights around 1789. So humans of the European variety arriving here. But of course, throughout this period, we would have had indigenous folks that knew this tree very well. There were years of very rapid growth, and they are interpreted in an interesting and ecological way. What happened around here around 1860 in general in southern Ontario? Clear cut. Southern Ontario has been called one of the world's largest clear cuts. And it's because around 1860, there was a wave of conversion of forested landscape to farmland. Part of it, interestingly, driven by the demand, the market demand for food going south to the US to fuel the Union during the Civil War. But the elm grew very rapidly in the years after about 1850 because the competition was cut down. The trees that would have been around it and could have given it slower growth were gone. And then finally we get up to about 1973, and the tree unfortunately succumbing to Dutch elm disease. Other slices through that tree still exist. Here's another one. This is at the University Club at McMaster University. This is also a piece of the elm, and they have an interpretive panel that's often up on the wall nearby that shows the story of this elm as well. I love this piece of wood. It's beautiful to run your hands across it and feel that time, 400 years of wood underneath your hands. And there's something to look for if you're over there, and it's up here in the corner. There's a bullet in that tree. There is a little lead ball that somebody shot at that tree probably sometime in the 19th century or early 20th. And just by dumb luck, when they sliced this cookie out of the trunk, they sliced right through the bullet. And it's polished, and you can see it sitting right there in the trunk. It's a fascinating artifact. Sometimes the documentation is all that's left. And again, I've been working with my colleagues here and in archives on the landscape of Royal Botanical Gardens to understand. We didn't just suddenly become 2,700 acres. We became smaller things earlier. And the first part of the landscape that was called Royal Botanical Gardens was just the south shore of Cootes Paradise Marsh. And this was what was designated as Royal Botanical Gardens in 1930, when King George V gave the Hamilton Board of Park Management permission to call it Royal Botanical Gardens. We have the one-sentence memo in our archives. That's all it is, a one-sentence memo saying His Majesty would be pleased if you called it Royal. The north shore of Cootes Paradise was not part of RBG until 1942, when Thomas Baker McQuestion sold it to the board for $1 an acre. He was at that time both the chairman of the board and also the Minister of Transportation that owned the land. So a bit of insider dealing, but for the public good. Other things like the Burlington Heights with the rock garden at the top and Henry Park, where we are, became called part of RBG around 1932 by the board. They put all these pieces together at that point. Now in 1932, they hired a young man from McMaster University named Harold Sen. And Harold was a grad student at Mac in botany, studying under an amazing woman named Lulu Odell Gazer. Does anybody know Lulu? Oh, goody, I can tell you about Lulu. Jim does. Hi, Jim. So Lulu Odell Gazer was the first woman appointed a faculty member at a university in Canada after 1920. She was the first female faculty member at McMaster University. And she was a botanist and a geneticist. She was Canada's first cytogeneticist, studying genetics by actually looking at chromosomes through a microscope. The first one in Canada. She actually started teaching at McMaster while McMaster was still in Toronto in 1927. And then Mac made the move to Hamilton, seduced here by our city, in 1930 to the campus on the south shore of Cootes Paradise Marsh. And she was involved in all sorts of interesting stories at the university. At one point in time, the biology department split and became zoology and botany, and she ran the botany department, and then it came back together again. She finally passed away in the 1960s and is buried west of London. But anyway, Lulu was Harold's supervisor. There's a picture of Harold as an older man. This is not how he looked as an undergraduate. But what his job was to survey the trees in Westdale Ravine and that land that was being called Royal Botanical Gardens. We didn't have a list of the trees at that point. And there were all sorts of thoughts about creating Royal Botanical Gardens around those ravines on the South Shore, and making them interpretive, not replacing the ravines, but showing people those trees, putting labels on them. And that is actually one of the first plant labels from Royal Botanical Gardens. We have one in our archive. It's a ceramic label on a heavy metal backing, possibly lead, with the red oak, Quercus rubra, Fagaceae labeling North America on it. That's actually fired on the ceramic surface. It's actually a little tile, ceramic tile. They put out 300 of those tags on the trees along the Westdale Ravine in 1932-33, and I have always wondered whether there are any of them still there. Of course, by now, if they had survived, the trees would have enfolded them and brought them into themselves. Most likely, they were all pushed off as the trees grew outward and were destroyed. We have a couple of copies of Harold's report in our archives. So we know the distribution of the trees in Westdale circa 1932. 17% of those trees were white oak. Northern red oak accounted for another 13%. Red maple, 8%, another 8% were paper birch, and so on. Some of these trees now, of course, extremely rare. 5% of the trees in Westdale were butternut back then. Now, really difficult to find. White elm, about 3.5% of the tree population is white elm. What's sad about the story about Harold's survey is we don't have his map. He wrote up his survey in great detail, describing the trees. He even included a section on his vision for what should become of Royal Botanical Gardens, how it could be used to teach the people of the city of Hamilton about trees. His map, which was apparently presented publicly in 1933 at the end of his project, remember that whole area I showed you, the South Shore of Cootes Paradise, was 1 inch equals 20 feet. The scale of that map was enormous, and he labeled the location of every one of his trees on it. So if anybody knows where Harold's map is, please let us know. Harold went on to have a very distinguished career as a botanist. Dr. Pringle actually met Harold Sen at one point. And Jim, you've told me that Harold at one point in time said he was actually RBG's first employee. Yes, he thought of himself that way. RBG didn't exist as an organization until 1941. And we usually recognize our first employee as the landscape architect, Matt Broman, who was the foreman on the construction of the rock garden a decade earlier. He was hired as the garden superintendent. Today we're working on a variety of projects. I've mentioned the heritage trees we have informally defined in our cultivated garden areas like the Dawn Redwood and the beautiful red oak. But the nature sanctuaries here include some very old trees, very large trees in the ravines. And there's a list online. If you go to our website, you can find it. There's butternut out there, some enormous butternut. Bitternut hickory, white oak in the nature sanctuaries. Some of these are the largest trees of their species in Canada, right here. And we're very proud that we've been able to steward that space and look forward to doing more. You can go online and find the entire list. Again, I don't expect you to read this from a distance, but the locations are there. A shagbark hickory that is estimated at 19 meters high, bitternut hickory at 20 meters, a white ash at 22. These are enormous trees. And of course, trees are habitat. We can't separate them. I don't want us to separate them because we have things like this at Royal Botanical Gardens because of these trees. The only reason the bald eagles have returned to Hamilton to nest are the 100-foot white pines around Cootes Paradise Marsh. So it may be a white pine, it may be a relatively common tree, but it's not a common tree if an eagle chooses to nest. So I'd like you to think about landscape, not just natural landscape and contrasting that with urban landscape, but landscape where people live. Because sometimes I think, and increasingly we're going to see, that distinction doesn't help us. 82% of Canada's population today is urban, human population. We live in cities. And for people to be in contact with other species growing without necessarily a whole lot of human intervention, we have to maybe break down the barriers in our minds between natural and cultivated. Certainly that's our theme now at Royal Botanical Gardens. We're working with some really interesting concepts around connecting people and plants. Again, it's an interesting thing that we are this combination of natural areas and gardens. Well, we don't care whether you come to nature or come to plants through nature or come to plants through horticulture. We will reach you with the message that living with plants brings you a better life. So we really hope people will think about landscape. We are the children of our landscape. It dictates behavior and even thought in the measure to which we are responsive to it. Novelist Lawrence Durrell wrote that in his novel Just. Carl Sagan put it even more eloquently. This oak tree and me, we are made of the same stuff. We are close relatives of these trees. They are us in so many ways that every time you hug a tree, you leave yourself behind. So I'd like to leave you tonight with a call to action. I want you to pay attention to the trees and fight plant blindness. Even if you're a birder, that's great. I love birds. They're reptiles, right? No, I love birds. But look at the tree they're living in. Understand that they're part of that habitat, that they're eating insects off that tree, that maybe they're helping to pollinate it or move seeds around. The trees and the habitat are together. We can't separate them in any way other than getting into reductionism, which is powerful scientifically, but ultimately not necessarily enriching. I'd like you to think about the stories that link people to trees, whether it's your grandmother's backyard or the school where you grew up, where there maybe was a tree in the yard, or some magnificent tree you know about in a nature sanctuary you go to. Document those stories, write them down. We had a magnificent American chestnut in the backyard of my grandmother's house in Wingham, Ontario. Of course, there's a swimming pool there now. We sold the house in 1974. But that tree was part of the growing up of my family for a couple of generations. And I remember that tree. I saw it as a child, and it's part of my thinking even today. You can do that too in different contexts. It doesn't matter if it's in a natural area or a city park or your backyard. Cherish that tree and come to understand it. And take a look at things like what Forests Ontario are doing to make these heritage trees better known to the public. Become a champion, even if it's just one tree. You can make a difference. You could get a tree listed by Forests Ontario as a heritage tree if you do the homework and if you do some work. So thank you very much for your time tonight, guys. I'm a little long, I know.
And as per usual, anyone has any questions for Dr. Galbraith?
Sure. Any questions, folks? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. I'm not aware that there is. That's an example from the list that's made available with a bit of work from the Ontario Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport, from their Heritage Office. And if memory serves, I had broken out all those species so we could see them. I think that example is part of a landscape that was designed by a designer. So there is a heritage story around the landscape in which those trees are found. They're considered as a heritage tree because of that. I don't think the Japanese internment is a part of that story, but it's an interesting possibility, and I will take a look for it. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I live in Dundas, very close to the tulip tree and the chinkapin oak. And the business of designating a tree as a heritage tree is a lot of work. And the person who did all that work in Dundas is here tonight, Mary Jo.
Yep.
And I would just like you to know that it is a lot of work. Mary
Yes.
did all of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. It's up there somewhere. And Mary, I gave another presentation like this at the Burlington Public Library earlier in the year, and Mary was there as well. And we talked a bit. Weren't you? Somebody was there from the Dundas group. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. one of your colleagues was there from the Dundas group. Yes, as you say, I mean, it's not a simple thing, and I wasn't suggesting it is, but it can be done. And there had been an organized group in Dundas that was going after these designations. There's no reason why that can't happen again, but my understanding is the group isn't active at the present time. Yes, in fact, hello.
The labels on the trees that the young man labeled in 1932.
Yes.
I moved to Hamilton in 1962 when I lived in Grade 5 Westdale Beach. And there were many of the labels on the trees back then. They were in surprising places, not just along the trail, but you find the labels. I moved away and then came back to Hamilton, as we all eventually do. And have not, I've looked through the labels many times.
Thank you for that observation. So she noted that in 1961, or was it 61? 62, so just 30 years after Harold had put those up, many of them were still visible. And some years later, they're not visible now. So I would love to know more about them. I don't know whether anyone ever photographed the ravine, and maybe there's a picture that would have a label on it. But we're so fortunate, again, we have a magnificent set of archives here. Assembled by our volunteers over many years, put into order by a volunteer named Marie Miniker. So we have some of Harold Sen's information, and we have that one magnificent plate that, again, we know about because various people collected that kind of stuff in years gone by. One of them that was very active and is still with us, fortunately, was Frank Fruchtman. Frank was our curator of living collections and added enormously to the collections. I know Dr. Pringle has over the years as well. We don't have a record as to where that specific label came from. It looks pristine. I don't think it was ever put on a tree, but we are fortunate to have an example of what they look like. And I wonder if they actually ordered them in from a company that would have made them as little ceramic tiles. Yes, please.
I discovered the tulip trees at the Arboretum, and I grew up in northern Saskatchewan. I was fascinated by the tulip tree that has tulip flowers in the springtime.
Yeah, she was noting the fact that these trees, these tulip trees, have flowers on them that look very much like tulips. They're not tulips, of course, biologically. They're magnolias. And there is a native tulip tree that's a Carolinian forest zone species. That's the plant that's on that street in Dundas. If you're over at RBG's Arboretum in the springtime, one of my favorite spots there, of course, our lilac collection gets a lot of press, but there's also a fantastic tulip tree collection there, magnolia collection with multiple colors, and they're big, mature trees. That's what she was talking about. Yes, yes. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful spot. Yeah. Yes, hello. The question from the audience member was whether some of these trees or some of the seeds from these very, very old trees are collected and made available through native tree nurseries and that kind of thing. I really don't know. In some cases, I expect they are. Certainly, that Vimy oak is not in that category, but it was propagated, I believe, by seed, by acorns. We'd have to go to somebody like Paul O'Hara and check on that one. It's a good question. I do know that, again, it's something that's not new. It's been planned for some time. Unfortunately, our capacity in Ontario to deal with tree seed has been diminished because the province is closing down the tree seed facility. That's not recent. That was in the planning for some time. But that's, again, a very good question. I don't know whether some of the heritage seed folks, whether they're into trees as much as they are into heirloom veggies. Maybe somebody here knows. Yes? Is there anything presenting Joe public? Is Joe here? Yeah. Anyone collecting? Oh, there's Joe at the back. Hey, Joe. Collecting these things themselves. No, there isn't, except, of course, we always urge people to respect property rights. If you're going onto a private property, those plants, those trees, and their seeds are the property of the landowner. So please ask. But if you're looking at something and collecting it with permission, I'm sure they might be very interested to have something collected. I know some of these trees, of course, are so prolific. We have a circle of red oak in the Arboretum at the circle, the parking circle, that produces buckets full of acorns every year. We drive on them and make crunchy noises. Again, if you're coming to RBG, please ask us before you collect anything. So there's nothing stopping it. And again, this heritage designation, my understanding is it's not like the Endangered Species Act, which actually regulates what you can do with the organisms themselves. If there is a bylaw enacted by a municipality that protects a tree, that protects the tree. I don't think it speaks to its offspring. But again, that's my only my understanding. I might be off on that. But it's much more a matter of asking permission to pick up the seeds from the property owner. Yes, ma'am, at the back. Hello.
Following up on that, section 135 of the municipal act is the operating legislation. Does it depend on what powers are available to the municipality in terms of like is it do they have to specify is it for free or is it
No, under the Heritage Act, it's possible for a municipality to craft several different kinds of heritage designations. There's a whole process that's set out in the Act for background paperwork, but it can apply to a physical structure, a natural area, if it has cultural significance, or a tree or a garden area. It's very flexible. It's entirely up to the municipality putting the bylaw together as to what is included in the bylaw and what it applies to. I think the bylaw does allow the municipality to specify that the tree, for example, cannot be harmed or damaged. But again, I'm not a lawyer and can't speak to that specifically. But that's under the Heritage Act, that's the one legal protection that can come. Under the Forests Ontario, they can designate a tree, but it doesn't have any legal standing. Sir, yes.
The big oak tree was actually grown from the tree in Scarborough, and at the year that they were supposed to start growing them for that project, there was no acorns available. So the nursery where I worked for grafted them that time. They actually went in there with one of those hydro trucks.
Right.
Took the science out of there, grafted them. Then when it came to the time to ship it to France, too much red tape was involved. So those trees have never made it to France, but the acorns the following year, that's the ones that made it to France. Then the Vinnie Foundation had them for sale for the regions and anybody who wanted to buy it. There was a fee of $125. There's still some available because I was wondering if anything ever happened to the people planting them. Would there be other ones available to replace them? Yes, there are. So they're still available through the video information.
That's wonderful, sir. Thank you. Was everyone able to hear that? The Vimeo saplings, there are still some available. I know a friend of mine has actually purchased one as his memorial in a cemetery. It'll be in Hamilton Cemetery. There's a Vimeo that's either going to be planted or is there now.
We'll take one last
one, sir. So this is a bur oak in Burlington. Right.
real landmark, and then all of a sudden it wasn't there. I assume that's something with highway lines.
Could be. There's a lot that's changed because of transportation. RBG's original lilac garden, for example, was under the 403. It was down along the shore of Coots Paradise Marsh on the Burlington Heights. So that is. I mean, the reality, of course, is that trees are not forever. I was thinking about, as I was working on my presentation, the old song "Puff the Magic Dragon." Right? Dragons live forever, but not trees. And even something that's as magnificent as a centuries-old oak, if we're planning for its management, we have to understand that at some point in time we probably won't have it. But that doesn't mean it has to go away forever. If there's a tree that is a real landmark, it certainly is possible to propagate it and to bring along baby trees and plan for a succession. Perhaps not as exciting as having the original, but it's the thought that comes to mind.